In this project, we're going to be looking at the link between customary land and livelihoods, and we're going to be using some remote sensing tools to do this project. So remote sensing is a set of geospatial tools that is really related to GIS, but it's actually kind of separate from GIS in many ways. So we're going to have to learn a little bit of some basics and background about remote sensing so that you can really get into this project the right way. We're going to be looking at customary land, and I've given you some readings about customary land and land tenure so that you know some background about what this means. But basically, in the South Pacific country of Vanuatu, about 80% of the population lives in rural areas, and all of this land is customary land. So there's technically no such thing as private property, meaning that this land cannot be bought or sold. It's not a commodity. There's no real estate market. So this customary land is, instead of governed by real estate law, it's governed by indigenous customary traditions, and which can be pretty complex, but basically the land is passed down from generation to the next, and there's some pretty complex social relations that regulate how this land is accessed and how it can be used and that sort of thing. But for us, right now, one of the important things to know is that this is one of the most important sources of livelihoods for people in Vanuatu and in other parts of the world too. So this land is a right. So it provides housing, or you can use the natural materials on this land to build housing if you don't have enough money to purchase materials to build a house like cement and that sort of thing. You can use natural materials to build a house. Provides food because you can grow your own food, and provides a source of water because you might either access freshwater sources, or you can build a rainwater catchment tank, which is what in our study area, what people in the western part of Ambai Island rely on rainwater. So this is really important because Vanuatu is one of the world's lowest income countries, but there's a really big contradiction because income does not determine the quality of life in a place like this, because there is the right to access this kind of land. So there's very little income, but Vanuatu has been ranked fairly high, pretty high on other indexes like the Happy Planet Index. And, it's important to note that there's really not homelessness or starvation that you see in a lot of very impoverished countries. That sort of thing is not really happening here. There are plenty of other social issues that we don't have time to deal with in this video, but in terms of those kind of meeting the basic needs, that's not really an issue here. And in part that has to do with customary land and what some people in Vanuatu are calling the traditional economy. There's a traditional economy, and that has a link with rights to customary land and stewardship of customary land, and it has to do with providing livelihoods. And this also has a big relationship with participating in community building and cultural ceremonies. So that is kind of the starting point for talking about this project. So we're going to be using remote sensing because this customary land, although it's such a great source of livelihood, it's also very vulnerable. So Vanuatu is tends to be one of the most highly ranked countries at risk for disasters in the world. And this is by the United Nations World Risk Report. And in the last one, I think it was in 2019, it was the world's highest ranked country for disaster risk. And basically what that means is there's a lot of disasters that can affect the country, and most of the population in that country is at risk for all of those disasters. And there's things like earthquakes, cyclones, droughts, and volcanoes, which all present numerous different types of risk and vulnerabilities. So what we're going to be doing in this project is looking at the resilience of some customary land in a rural part of Vanuatu before and after a tropical cyclone went through the country in April of 2020. So you're going to be using some remote sensing techniques using our software to analyze the change in vegetation before and after a tropical cyclone that went through Vanuatu in April of 2020. So we're going to be doing some things like not just looking at a visual picture, right? We're going to be using satellite imagery to analyze this change, but we're going to be really doing some you're going to get your feet wet a little bit with doing some of the more sophisticated remote sensing analysis that we can use, where we go beyond just looking at a visual picture to see if there was an impact. But we're going to be using things like different wavelengths, like the near infrared wavelength, which has a certain kind of reflectance on vegetation that we can't see with our eyes. But we're going to be using things like near infrared wavelengths to understand how impacted were all of the forests and all of the gardens, for example, before and after this hurricane, and maybe how quickly have they recovered. And then we're going to be using these geospatial tools, and we're going to be using them and understanding them and trying to explain our satellite imagery analysis through our other readings about customary land and land tenure, so that we don't just look at those satellite images without a little bit of context of that issue of land. So we're not just going to be looking at it and then thinking about it through some conventional thinking tools like deforestation or population impacts on the environment. We're going to try to be understanding the vegetation change and disaster impacts and that sort of thing. We're going to try to be looking at that through the importance of this land towards sustaining a population in a very sustainable way. And we're going to be thinking about this in terms of if these environments, if these customary lands are too damaged and too vulnerable, then that is going to be pushing people off of that land into other kinds of places that are less likelihood to provide sustainable livelihoods. So for example, if people are pushed into cities where they're much more dependent on cash income just to pay rent and to buy all the food that they need to live, all those basic necessities have to be paid for, whereas before they didn't have to be paid for. Well, then that might possibly introduce a whole host of other environmental concerns. So we're really going to be looking at our satellite imagery, our remote sensing analysis, and trying to understand and explain all of it through a critical lens in how customary lands and livelihoods that exist on customary lands provide a much more sustainable way of living due to the way that people work, and the way that people work and provide the means for their survival and their livelihoods has a certain relationship with the environment.